144. The Heresy of Perfect Justice. An important biblical word, which today has a very different meaning, is perfect. In Scripture it means complete, mature, clear, having integrity, fitted, or whole. In modern usage it has the implication of sinlessness, a very different meaning. When Scripture speaks of Noah, Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, and Job, Job chapter 1, verse 1, verse 8, chapter 2, verse 3, as perfect, it does not mean sinless, but complete, plain, that is, clear in faith and life, and whole. David gives us an indication of the meaning of the word in Psalm 37:37. Mark the perfect man, and behold the upright, for the end of that man is peace. Moffat rendered perfect in this verse as integrity. David sees it as identical with upright. The end of that man is godly peace, since he is the blessed meek, rather than the disorder and turmoil brought about by the wicked. This is so because the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delighteth in his way. Psalm 37, verse 23. The way of perfection, in the biblical sense, is the law of God. It provides the framework and the necessary means for the mature and complete life. God's law gives wholeness to covenant man, and it gives light to his eyes. In the words of David again, in Psalm 19, verses 7 to 11, the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is thy servant warned, and in keeping of them there is great reward. There is clearly a very great difference between sinless perfection and biblical perfection. The one has to do with an essentially individualistic quest for a sinless life. It can mean a withdrawal from the world of action as polluting, but in any case, it is a quest of the soul for a condition which is, in essence, a negative one, that is, to be sinless, whereas the biblical doctrine of perfection is in essence positive and active. Ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2. And the way of holiness and perfection is the law of the Lord. Thus, the biblical doctrine is not only more activistic, but it has an unchanging standard which is separate from man and is of the Lord. This puts a brake on man's quietism, but also on his activism. A central problem in human activism is the lust for perfect justice now. One of the most damaging aspects of our time and of history as a whole is a demand for perfect justice now. Such a demand creates radical injustice and a contempt for law, because it is the essence of man's courts that they are, at their best, slow, painstaking, and fallible. To illustrate, twice in my life I have seen situations where it was obvious that a man had been murdered, and the murderer was known by the authorities. In neither case was anything said or done, because no evidence existed which could stand up in court. As a result, there was no prosecution, and not even a word to tie the murderer to his crime. Biblical law requires a witness to a crime to testify. Leviticus chapter 5, verse 1. It also requires 2 witnesses to convict. Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15. These witnesses can be persons and/or circumstantial evidence, but 2 are required. Clearly, this law means that some guilty men escape judgment, but it makes clear the limitations of human justice. Men are not God. They cannot administer sinless justice, nor can they always ensure full justice. The need for full justice must be recognized, and Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 1 to 9 makes clear that unpunished murder must be atoned for. Restitution must be made. Thus, the law first insists on the full restoration of God's order, and nothing short of God's justice is right before God. Second, the law also recognizes that man is incapable of this perfect justice. The laws of witness bar man from attempting to do more than the required prosecution. Man cannot presume, in seeking perfect justice, to gain it by lawless means. Third, the legal requirement for restitution for all crime still enables man to effect the necessary restitution, even where judgment is impossible. God thus places a limitation on man's ability to prosecute, while retaining the requirement for restitution. Let us see what this means practically. One of the most trying of pastoral and criminal cases is that of the unreasoning demand for justice in cases where no proof exists. A pastor will be confronted by people who are vehement in insisting, "I know that my husband, wife, or that church member is guilty of such and such an offence, even though I can't prove it in terms of your requirements." The police or the district attorney will get like statements. These are sometimes imaginary charges and sometimes valid ones. In either case, the accuser is insistent that their knowledge or charge must be the ground for prosecution. The basis for prosecution, however, is God's law, not the offence we have suffered. The false idea of the liberty of discretion transfers initiative with respect to the law from God to man. It declares that man can forgive where God requires judgment, and it declares that man can demand prosecution where God's law forbids it. Let us be specific by way of illustration. A woman charges her husband, a church officer, with adultery. He denies it firmly. She insists it is true, begins to talk against her husband throughout the church, although not a trace of evidence can be produced. No charge should be filed against her husband, because a charge requires evidence. She must be charged in terms of Leviticus chapter 19, verse 16, as a talebearer and false witness. Her conduct is ground for divorce. She has deserted her husband by her conduct and despised God's law in favour of her demands, and is thus to be excommunicated. In another case, a church officer is guilty of adultery, but the wife suppresses the evidence and silences the witness to preserve her home and her meal ticket. As a result, an ugly situation festers in the life of the church until the church officer becomes involved with a high school girl in a youth camp, and the matter becomes a public scandal. The husband is guilty of adultery, and the wife is a party to it. Psalm 50, verse 18. We can neither set aside the law nor insist on its enforcement on our terms without sin. Man's idea of perfect justice is one which costs him nothing and profits him at every turn. The processes of justice, however, cannot move on man's terms, but on God's. justice and righteousness are one and the same thing, they cannot be separated. Righteousness must mark not only the law, but its process. This is the meaning of the law of witnesses.